January 14, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls in silence. Not the gentle silence of a winter morning, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows artillery fire. Beneath the skeletal branches of oak and pine, a column of German panzer grenadiers moves through knee-deep drifts, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. They are veterans of the Eastern Front, men who have learned to read the language of war in the crunch of frost beneath their boots, in the distant rumble that might be thunder or might be tanks. Their commander, Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, raises his fist. The column halts. Through the trees, perhaps 300 meters distant, they see them, 5 American Sherman tanks arranged in a loose formation near a destroyed farmhouse. The Germans have faced Shermans before. They know the silhouette, know the vulnerabilities. The 75mm gun that struggles against Tiger armor. The welded hull that burns when penetrated. The Americans call them Ronsons, lights first time every time. Dietrich signals his Panzerschreck teams forward. This should be straightforward. What none of these men understand, what they cannot possibly comprehend as they take their positions in the frozen underbrush, is that they are not facing 5 separate tanks. They are facing a single coordinated organism, connected by invisible threads of radio communication more sophisticated than anything in the German arsenal. They are about to encounter not just American steel, but American information. And in war, information is the difference between a battle and a massacre. The story of the Sherman tank's radio superiority does not begin in the forests of Belgium, but in the fundamental philosophical differences between how America and Germany conceived of armored warfare. When the German military developed its panzer forces in the 1930s, it created magnificent machines, the Panther, the Tiger, mechanical marvels of engineering that could outgun and outarmor almost anything on the battlefield. But the German approach to communication reflected their rigid command structure. Tank radios were expensive, complex devices manufactured with precision components that required skilled labor. In the early war period, only German command tanks carried radios capable of both transmission and reception. The majority of panzers could only receive orders. They could not respond, could not coordinate, could not adapt. A platoon of German tanks fought not as a unified force, but as individuals following predetermined instructions from a commander who might be 3 tanks away, visible only through the smoke and chaos of battle. The Americans took a different path. When the Signal Corps began developing the SCR-508 series radio for installation in Sherman tanks, they were not thinking about individual tank performance. They were thinking about the battlefield as a system, as a vast network of interconnected nodes where information could flow freely in all directions. Every Sherman tank, not just command vehicles, but every single M for that rolled off the production lines in Detroit, Chicago, and Lima, received a complete radio suite. The SCR-508 for vehicle-to-vehicle communication. The SCR-528 for communication with infantry. 10 crystal-controlled channels. Frequency modulation that resisted jamming. Voice clarity that allowed rapid, complex coordination. And critically inexpensively, mass-produced with standardized components that any mechanic could maintain, any radio man could operate. Where a German tank commander might spend weeks training on radio procedure, an American tank crew learned the basics in days. This was not because Americans were simpler soldiers, but because American engineers had made simplicity itself into a weapon. The German soldiers in the Ardennes Forest cannot see any of this. What they see are Shermans, and Shermans die. They have killed Shermans at Villers-Bocage, at Caen in the hedgerows of Normandy, where German 88s turned American armor into burning coffins. Dietrich has personally witnessed 3 Shermans destroyed by a single Tiger tank in less than 4 minutes. He signals the attack. The Panzerschreck teams move into position, their rocket launchers loaded with shaped charges capable of penetrating 160 millimeters of armor. At 200 meters, they cannot miss. The first rocket launches with a roar and a backblast that sends snow swirling in a white vortex. It streaks toward the nearest Sherman, and for a moment, Dietrich allows himself to believe this will be like all the other times. The Sherman's turret was already rotating before the rocket left the tube. Not because the crew had seen the Panzerschreck team, the trees obscured them, but because the Sherman 400 meters to the south had spotted the German position and radioed immediately. Baker 2 to Baker lead at team bearing 320, 200 meters from your position, Trieline, prepare to receive fire. The warning traveled at the speed of light through the SCR-508, arrived in the headsets of 5 tank commanders simultaneously, and translated into action before the rocket had covered half its distance. The Sherman's driver, without waiting for orders, was already reversing into a hull-down position behind the farmhouse foundation. The gunner traversed the turret to the bearing provided by the spotting tank. The loader already had a high-explosive round chambered. When the Panzerschreck rocket impacted, it struck not the Sherman's vulnerable side armor, but the reinforced hull of the farmhouse itself, exploding in a shower of brick and frozen mortar while the Sherman disappeared behind cover. 3 seconds later, that same Sherman's 75mm cannon spoke, and the high-explosive shell detonated precisely where the spotting tank had indicated, sending German infantrymen diving for cover. But more significantly, the radio chatter continued. Baker, lead to all Baker units, infantry at, Treline 320, estimate platoon strength, close, and suppress. 5 Shermans, which moments before had seemed scattered and vulnerable, suddenly moved with the coordination of wolves, converging on the German position from 3 directions while maintaining continuous communication about enemy positions, friendly locations, ammunition status, terrain obstacles. Dietrich realizes, with the cold clarity that comes to men facing death, that something is profoundly wrong. These tanks are not behaving like the Shermans he has fought before. They are not advancing blindly or holding defensive positions while attempting to spot enemies with vision alone. They are sharing eyes. When one sees, all see. When one identifies a threat, all respond. He orders his men to fall back, to break contact, but the radios in the Shermans are already transmitting to artillery units 5 kilometers behind the lines. Fire mission coordinates 51.2, 84.7, enemy infantry in Treline, request smoke, and danger close authorized. The first artillery rounds arrive 45 seconds later, not the scattered, hopeful bombardment of armies guessing at enemy positions, but precisely targeted fire coordinated through the same radio network linking the Sherman tanks to the battalion command post to the artillery batteries. The Germans retreat through exploding shells, and Dietrich understands that he has not fought 5 tanks. He has fought the entire American communication network, and his men, brave as they are, skilled as they are, never had a chance. This was not an isolated incident. Across every theater where American armor operated, the same pattern repeated. In the bocage country of Normandy, where narrow lanes between tall hedgerows created a maze that should have favored defenders, German soldiers discovered that American tank platoons communicated constantly, warning each other of every ambush, every anti-tank position, every hidden panther waiting to strike. A German tank might successfully destroy 1 Sherman, only to find itself immediately targeted by 3 others whose commanders already knew its exact position, already had their guns traversed, already had the range calculated. In North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps had mastered the art of rapid, decisive armored maneuver, German commanders found themselves outmaneuvered by American forces that coordinated movements across dozens of kilometers with casual radio chatter, adjusting plans in real time, while German units waited for motorcycle couriers to carry orders from headquarters. The numbers tell the story that individual battles cannot. By 1944, American armored divisions were achieving breakthrough rates 3 times faster than comparable German units. Not because Sherman tanks were faster, they weren't. Not because American crews were better trained. In many cases, they had less experience. The difference was information speed. An American armored unit encountering resistance could identify the threat, coordinate a flanking maneuver, and execute it in the time it took a German unit to send a status report back to headquarters and wait for orders. The U.S. Army's own after-action reports from the European theater noted that radio-equipped tank platoons achieved objectives with 40% fewer casualties than theoretically comparable forces relying on visual signals and runners. The German Army, reading captured American tactical manuals, initially dismissed the emphasis on radio communication as typical American over-reliance on technology. They did not understand that the technology was not the point. The point was the philosophy, that every soldier, every tank, every unit could be trusted to communicate, to adapt, to make decisions. The psychological impact went deeper than tactical advantage. German tank commanders had been trained in a tradition that emphasized individual heroism, the ace tanker who destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles through superior skill and courage. Men like Michael Wittmann, who famously destroyed multiple Allied tanks at Villers-Bocage, were celebrated as heroes because their achievements were exceptional, 1 man, 1 tank, dominating through personal ability. American tank doctrine did not produce such heroes, not because American crews lacked courage, but because the radio made individual heroism less relevant. An American tank commander was not trying to be the best tank on the battlefield. He was trying to be the most effective node in network. When First Lieutenant John R. Daly Sherman encountered a German Tiger tank near Sankvith, he did not attempt to fight it alone. He radioed its position to his platoon, maneuvered to keep it localized, and coordinated with 2 other Shermans to attack from multiple angles while a 4th tank contacted artillery support. The Tiger was destroyed without Daly firing a shot. There were no medals for such victories, no dramatic stories of individual heroism. Just efficiency. Just survival. Just the quiet, devastating effectiveness of information moving faster than the enemy could respond. German soldiers, encountering this system repeatedly, began to experience something their training had not prepared them for: the sense of fighting an enemy who is always watching, always coordinating, always one step ahead. A Panther commander might successfully hide his tank, camouflaged perfectly, waiting for American armor to advance into his kill zone. The Americans would approach, then suddenly halt. A minute later, artillery would begin falling on his position. He would never know that a dismounted infantry scout, 200 meters away, had spotted the camouflaged tank and radioed its position, not to his own headquarters, but directly to the tank unit's radio frequency, because American doctrine integrated infantry and armor communication networks. The scout carried an SCR-300 backpack radio that could reach the tank's SCR-508 sets. Information flowed horizontally, instantly, without requiring approval up and down a chain of command. The Panther commander would abandon his position, retreat to a new location, and an hour later, American tanks would appear and destroy the position he had abandoned because reconnaissance aircraft, equipped with radios, had spotted his movement and reported it to ground units in real time. The German soldier began to feel that he was not fighting an army, but a vast, omniscient system that could see everything, know everything, respond to everything. This feeling was not paranoia. It was accurate. The American military had turned the battlefield into an information space, and the Germans were operating in it nearly blind. Consider the Battle of Aricourt in September 1944, where the 4th Armored Division engaged multiple German panzer brigades in the largest tank battle on the Western Front. On paper, the Germans held advantages: more tanks, heavier armor, superior main guns. The 4th Armored fielded primarily Shermans, undergunned and underarmored by comparison. Yet over 10 days of fighting, American forces destroyed or disabled over 200 German tanks while losing fewer than 40 of their own, a kill ratio that seemed impossible given the technical specifications of the vehicles involved. The difference was not the tanks. It was that the American tanks fought as a network system, constantly communicating, sharing target information, coordinating artillery support, adjusting tactics in real time based on observed German movements. The Germans fought as individual units, making decisions based on local information, unaware that their local information was incomplete, outdated, or wrong. When a German commander saw American tanks retreating, he could not know whether it was a genuine retreat or a coordinated maneuver to draw him into an ambush. When he encountered resistance, he could not know whether he was facing a platoon or a battalion, because American units could concentrate force faster than he could gather information. The radios themselves became symbols, not of American technological superiority, but of something more fundamental, more threatening to the Nazi worldview. The German military system was hierarchical by design, reflecting the broader Nazi ideology of leadership, the Führerprinzip, the idea that wisdom and authority flowed downward from superior men to inferior men. Tank radios, in this system, were tools of command. The superior officer transmitted orders, the inferior received them. This was not merely practical, but ideological. Allowing tank crews to communicate freely with each other implied that ordinary soldiers could make important decisions, could coordinate without oversight, could be trusted with information. The American radio network, by contrast, embodied a democratic principle, that information should be available to everyone who needed it, that soldiers at every level could contribute to victory, that the man in the tank had something valuable to say. When a Sherman crew radioed a contact report, battalion commanders listened to the same transmission as other tank crews, artillery observers, and infantry platoon leaders. German prisoners, interrogated about American tactics, often expressed confusion about American command structure. Who was in charge during an engagement? The answer: that whoever had the best information made suggestions, and units coordinated without rigid hierarchy, seemed to them like chaos. How could an army function if lieutenants were making strategic decisions? But what looked like chaos was actually emergence, complex, adaptive behavior arising from simple rules and good information. The rules were simple. Communicate what you see. Listen to what others report. Coordinate your actions with nearby units. Accomplish the mission. The information was good because the radios made it good, fast, clear, reliable, available to everyone. The result was an armored force that could adapt faster than the enemy could plan, that could concentrate force where it was needed without waiting for orders, that could survive mistakes because other units would compensate automatically. There is a document in the U.S. National Archives, a report filed by a Signal Corps officer in March 1945, that captures this transformation with clinical precision. The officer had been tasked with evaluating combat effectiveness of armored units relative to radio equipment quality. He noted that units with functioning radios completed offensive operations in an average of 4.2 hours. Units whose radios had been damaged or destroyed took an average of 11.7 hours to complete identical objectives. The difference was not firepower, not armor, not training, it was communication speed. The officer concluded his report with a sentence that should be engraved on monuments: "The radio has proven more essential to armored warfare than the cannon." He was not exaggerating. A Sherman tank with a broken gun could still serve as a scout, as a communication relay, as a coordinator for artillery fire. A Sherman with a broken radio was isolated, vulnerable, exponentially less effective. The Americans understood this so well that field maintenance crews prioritized radio repair over almost everything else. A tank with a damaged track might wait days for repair. A tank with a damaged radio would have a Signal Corps team working on it within hours. By the winter of 1944, as the war ground through its final months, German tactical doctrine began attempting to adapt. Orders came down from headquarters: target American communication equipment. Anti-tank teams were instructed to aim for the radio antennas protruding from Sherman turrets. It was too late, and it was inadequate. The antennas were small, flexible, difficult to hit. More fundamentally, destroying one tank's radio did nothing to disrupt the network. The tanks simply moved closer to another friendly vehicle and relied on their radios instead. The Americans had built redundancy into their system at every level. Each tank had backup radios. Each platoon had multiple tanks. Each company could relay messages through any functional unit. The Germans were trying to fight a network with tactics designed for fighting individuals, and it was like trying to kill a spider web by cutting one strand. The symbolic power of the radio antenna became, in those final months, a kind of totem. To German soldiers in their increasingly desperate defensive positions, the sight of multiple Sherman antennas appearing over a ridgeline was not just evidence of enemy armor, it was evidence of enemy coordination, enemy information superiority, enemy inevitability. They knew that those antennas meant the American tanks were already talking to each other, already sharing what they saw, already coordinating their attack. The antenna represented something beyond technology. It represented an army that trusted its soldiers to think, to communicate, to act independently within a coordinated framework. For men who had been raised in a system that demanded obedience and discouraged initiative, who had been told that strength came from hierarchy and discipline, the American approach was almost incomprehensible. How can an army of individuals defeat an army of soldiers? Yet it was happening every day, in every engagement where American armor encountered German forces. There were moments when individual German commanders grasped what they were facing. Oberst Ernst von Schroeder, commanding a panzer battalion in the American Forest, wrote in his diary after a particularly devastating engagement, "We are fighting not tanks but a system. Our Panthers are superior to their Shermans in every measurable way, yet we lose. We lose because they know where we are before we know where they are. We lose because when we destroy one of their tanks, 3 others immediately respond, as if they share one mind. We lose because they do not fight as we fight, as warriors seeking glory, but as technicians solving a problem. And the problem, I fear, is us." Von Schroeder survived the war, was captured in April 1945, and spent 2 years in a prisoner camp where he studied, obsessively, American military doctrine. He later wrote that the radio network in Sherman tanks was more responsible for Germany's defeat than any single weapon system, including the atomic bomb. The bomb ended the war quickly, he wrote. But the radios ensured that America would win the war eventually, inevitably, through systematic destruction of our ability to coordinate, to concentrate force, to respond to changing circumstances. They made warfare a matter of information speed, and in that contest we were centuries behind. The liberation of German concentration camps by American armored divisions brought an additional, bitter irony to this story. The same tanks whose radios had coordinated the destruction of German military units now rolled through the gates of Dachau, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf. The same communication networks that had been sharing target coordinates now transmitted eyewitness reports of atrocities so vast that officers initially did not believe them. Sherman commanders radioed back descriptions of what they were seeing and were told to document everything to ensure that history would know. The radios that had been tools of military victory became tools of historical testimony. And there is something deeply appropriate in this, that the technology embodying democratic principles, free flow of information, trust in individual soldiers to communicate truth, became the technology that documented the ultimate consequences of Nazi hierarchy and Nazi ideology. The concentration camps were what happened when a system concentrated all power and all knowledge at the top, when orders flowed only downward, when soldiers were taught not to question or communicate, but only to obey. The radio networks were the opposite. Systems designed to ensure that everyone knew, everyone could speak, everyone contributed to the collective understanding of truth. After the war, when the U.S. Army conducted its comprehensive analysis of what had made its armored forces effective, the radio system emerged again and again as the single most significant advantage. Not the Sherman's reliability, though that mattered. Not American industrial production, though that provided the numbers. Not even American air power, though that shaped every battlefield. It was communication. It was the speed at which information moved. It was the philosophy that information should be available to everyone who needed it, that soldiers could be trusted to use that information wisely, that coordination did not require rigid hierarchy. The Sherman tank itself has an ambiguous legacy. Military historians debate endlessly whether it was adequate, whether American soldiers deserved better armor protection, whether the 75mm gun was sufficient. But the radio inside every Sherman, that is not ambiguous. That was transformative. That changed armored warfare permanently, established principles that remain fundamental in modern military communication networks. When contemporary soldiers coordinate through digital tactical networks, when drones share targeting information in real time, when battlefield management systems integrate information from satellites, aircraft, and ground units simultaneously, they are using technology that would have been inconceivable in 1945, but they are applying principles that were proven in the radios of Sherman tanks. The principle that information must flow freely. The principle that every node in a network increases the effectiveness of every other node. The principle that communication speed is combat power. The principle that soldiers can be trusted. In the snow-covered forests of Belgium, on that January morning, when Hauptmann Dietrich watched American tanks coordinate their response to his ambush with a speed and precision he had never encountered, he was witnessing the future of warfare. He could not have known it then. He was too busy trying to save his men, trying to extract them from a battle that had gone wrong in ways his training could not explain. The radios in the Sherman tanks, mass-produced, simple to operate, available to every crew, represented something more than military technology. They represented an idea that free communication between equals was stronger than hierarchical command from superiors. That ordinary soldiers, trusted with information and given the tools to share it, would make better collective decisions than brilliant generals controlling every detail from headquarters. That democracy, even in the rigid hierarchical structure of an army, could be a source of strength rather than weakness. The Germans never understood this. They saw the radios and thought, technology. They tried to jam the frequencies, destroy the equipment, disrupt the transmissions. They never grasped that the radios were not the source of American strength, they were the expression of it. The radios worked because American doctrine trusted soldiers to communicate. American soldiers communicated effectively because their culture valued horizontal information sharing over vertical command. And American culture valued those things because, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, it was built on principles of individual dignity, mutual cooperation, and shared access to truth. The German soldiers in the Ardennes never knew they were fighting radios. They thought they were fighting tanks, and they fought bravely with the courage and skill that had made the Wehrmacht one of the most formidable military forces in history. But courage is not enough when the enemy knows everything you do the moment you do it. Skill is not enough when the enemy coordinates responses faster than you can coordinate attacks. They were fighting with 1870s communication technology, messengers, signal flags, line-of-sight observation, against an enemy using 1940s communication technology integrated into a 1940s understanding of how information shapes battle. The gap was not closable through bravery. It was not closable through superior weapons. It could only be closed by abandoning the fundamental assumptions of hierarchical command and embracing the messy, chaotic, enormously effective system of distributed coordination that the radios enabled. And so the war ended as it had to end, with American and Soviet armies meeting at the Elbe River, with German forces destroyed, not just physically but systematically, their ability to coordinate shattered, their command structure fragmented, their units isolated and overwhelmed. The Sherman tanks, with their radios chattering constantly, rolled through Berlin. Not the most powerful tanks on the battlefield. Not the best armored or most heavily gunned. But connected. Networked. Coordinated. Effective. The antennas still protruding from their turrets, still carrying voices and information, and the endless tactical chatter that had proven more lethal than high-velocity cannons. Those radios had done what no amount of armor plating could do. They had made average machines extraordinary by allowing them to work together, to share what they knew, to be more than the sum of their parts. In the end, the story of the Sherman tanks radio is not really about tanks at all. It is about what happens when you give people the tools to communicate freely and trust them to use those tools well. It is about the power of horizontal networks over vertical hierarchies. It is about information moving at the speed of light instead of the speed of a motorcycle messenger. Is about tactical decisions made by the people who are there on the ground in the moment, instead of strategic plans made by distant commanders who cannot see what is actually happening. These principles were proven in the fires of World War II, in the snow-covered forests and burning cities, where Sherman crews radioed contact reports and coordinate requests and target updates, where information flowed freely and units coordinated spontaneously, and an army of individuals became something greater than any hierarchy could create. The radios in the Sherman tanks were more than equipment. They were, in a very real sense, the voice of democracy in mechanical form, imperfect, sometimes chaotic, but ultimately more powerful than any authoritarian system could match. They allowed ordinary soldiers to speak and be heard. They allowed ideas to flow in all directions instead of only downward. They allowed truth to emerge from collective observation rather than being dictated from above. And in doing so, they helped win not just battles but the war itself by ensuring that the army fighting for freedom had the tools to embody freedom in its very structure. That is their legacy. That is the truth that Hauptmann Dietrich learned in the frozen forests of Belgium, and that military forces around the world are still learning today. That communication is combat power, that information is ammunition, and that soldiers who are trusted to speak will always, eventually, defeat soldiers who are only trusted to obey. The snow fell silently in the Ardennes that January morning, covering the battlefield in white, obscuring the tracks of retreating German forces and advancing American armor. But the radio waves passed through the snow without impediment, carrying voices, carrying data, carrying the future of warfare in invisible streams of information that no winter could silence, no armor could block, no hierarchy could control. And in that simple fact lies everything that mattered about why the war ended as it did, and why free societies, for all their apparent chaos and disorder, possess advantages that disciplined tyrannies can never match. The radios in the Sherman tanks proved it, one transmission at a time, one coordinated action at a time, one battle at a time, until the proof was written across Europe in the tracks of American armor and the voices that guided them through the static to victory.